Greetings, I'm Jeremiah, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the Throw Zone, where I'm going to teach you all about the juggling arts. Today's lesson is going to be in club spinning, and we're going to be exploring hip reels. Hip reel extensions, to be precise, and the various forms they come in. This video builds on some of the other skills we've learned in previous club spinning tutorials. You can find those in the description below if you feel like this video is getting ahead of you. Before we start, I also want to say that club spinning has been around for generations as a form of physical fitness using weighted clubs. These are not weighted clubs, and the techniques that I'll be going over in this series are intended for the art of club manipulation and spinning. If you're planning on using weighted clubs, that is not what this class is intended for. This video will be mirrored for the ease of following along. So when you see me using my right hand, it'll kind of look like I'm using my left hand as if you're looking in a mirror. That's to help it make it easier for you to follow along. So let's get started. We're going to establish every position we're using before we try the two-handed move. So with my right hand, I'm going to extend in the clockwise direction, and when I get to the 6 o'clock position, I'm going to add a little spin behind my body and then continue in the extension. So when I get to 6 o'clock, I need to allow that spin to happen behind my back. And I'm going to switch to using a socket grip when I get back there. The socket grip is holding the club's knob in your hand like so. Think of it like a ball and socket joint. Extend, add that swing. Whereas when I'm out here, I can use my ring grip to hold on to the club firmly. Switching to the other hand, this arm's going to move in the counterclockwise direction, since we're going to start out with the opposite version of this pattern. And when it gets down to 6 o'clock, I'm going to add that little spin behind the hip, allowing it to rotate. If it doesn't feel smooth, it probably isn't. You need to allow that full swing to happen. From the back, it'll look like this. Try doing them both in same time now. So first, extending cross-armed, and then adding the hip reels behind your back. Try not to allow them to bump into each other. If you bring your arms down too far, that will happen. As an extra challenge, if you've worked your way through the shoulder reels, try to add shoulder reels at the top and hip reels at the bottom. Now let's try it in the other direction. So establish the spin first. Right arm is going to move in the counterclockwise direction this time and duck behind the hip. Only once it passes my body does it go behind the hip though. And that's going to also require that you allow the club to spin. You just have to move it to the back plane. Once you've got that with your right hand, try it with the left hand. Clockwise this time. Extend, let it fall behind your hip. There's often a tendency when you're learning this version of the hip reel to use the ring grip to spin in the back plane. It would look like this. But you really want to resist that urge and instead use the socket grip to spin behind the hip. It's going to allow you to stay lower, and it's going to be a more true 6 o'clock position. It'll open up more movement possibilities for you down the road. So don't use ring grip to get back there, use the socket grip to get back there. It's going to keep it tighter. Combining them together so that on the extension, they both drop behind the hip. Or maybe you can add the shoulder reels and the hip reels. Now this one is useful to start with a swing. so that I'm going to start with my right hand doing the swing and extending, and then my left hand will start its swing when this one's at its top. There should be a moment where they're both pointed upward, one mid hip reel and the other one pointing upward in its extension. So it goes like this. Extend, swing, extend. Now let's try it in the other direction. This one's a little tricky to start. I like to start in full extensions with each hand. And when it gets to the bottom, start to add my pedals. Or add my hip reels. Remember to try and keep it in socket grip. Don't go to ring grip to get back there. Ring grip would look more like this, which is more of adding a pedal at 3 and 9 o'clock and trying to cheat it down instead of adding a true 6 o'clock pedal. See the difference? If you need to, break it down to each hand, right? Right hand extends, hits the shoulder reel, then hits the hip reel. Shoulder, hip, extend. Shoulder, extend, hip, extend. Shoulder, extend, hip, extend. Same thing with the other hand. Shoulder, hip, shoulder, hip. Then you can combine them together. Shoulder, hip. Now let's do same direction, same time, with each hand moving in the clockwise direction. If you need to, break it down to one hand. Extend. Let it fall behind the hip. By the way, when I say if you need to, I mean I highly recommend it if you've never tried this trick before. Building the muscle memory in advance is really useful when you make it as simple as possible, it makes it easier to learn. So with the left hand, I extend in the clockwise direction. When it gets down to the hip, I switch to the socket grip for that one spin, using the momentum of the swing to carry it up and around behind the hip. Left hand, now switch to the right hand, do the same thing. Once I have the two together, now I can time them at the same time, extend, add that hip reel at the bottom. Socket grip in both hands when you add that hip reel. Great. Try the other direction. Same thing. Extend, add that hip reel. Extend, add that hip reel. Now we're going counterclockwise. Now with the right hand, extend, add that hip reel. Both hands. Challenge time. When you start to extend, that's your moment to turn. Next challenge, try and add the shoulder reels and the hip reels. Shoulder reel followed by the hip reel. Once again, you might need to break it down to a drill with one club, just acknowledging the various positions. First the shoulder, then the hip, then the shoulder, then the hip, shoulder, then the hip, shoulder, then the hip, and only then combine them together. Shoulder, hip, shoulder, hip. You could extend this too if you want. Gives you a lot of range of motion. Hip reels and shoulder reels are especially useful for developing this kind of range of motion. Split time, same direction. You're going to want to start with your right hand. Extend up and around. Let the left hand follow it so they're always pointing in opposite directions. And then once you get to the hip, add that hip reel. By the time you're finishing that hip reel, the other one will be down there so that you can add another circle. So the whole thing looks like this. Right extends, left extends, hip reel, hip reel. Extend, extend, hip reel, hip reel. Let's try the other direction. Left hand's gonna lead this time, counterclockwise. Right hand follows, hip reel, extend, extend, hip reel, hip reel. You know what the next challenge is? Turn. So you get to this point where left hand and right hand are both extended. Left hand is about to dip behind me for its hip reel, and instead I turn 360 degrees before I add that next hip reel. Oops. Last challenge, and this one's kind of weird because of how they conflict, would be to try and add the shoulder reels and the hip reels at the same time. So if I'm going to start with my right hand extending and entering those hip reels, when I come up to try and do the shoulder reels, watch what happens. I add the shoulder reels and they end up moving in the opposite direction and they end up wanting to collide. So you have to keep them far enough apart to be able to do so. You almost might think of it as more like a 3 and 9 o'clock if you want to add that extra spin, rather than trying to go up behind the head, because the conflict is real. That might work out better. There we go. Or in the other direction. Left hand leads this time, drop behind the hips, add that extra spin. Behind the hips, add that extra spin. Thanks so much for being here. Those hip reels and those shoulder reels are going to be really useful in helping you develop a pretty thorough understanding of how the space around you can be used when club spinning. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment to subscribe. There's going to be lots more coming at you similar to it. Instruction in the juggling and flow arts. And check out the Patreon, where you can connect with a like-minded community, learn from one another, connect with me directly as an instructor, and take some one-on-one classes if you like. Have fun out there.